My name is Eleanor May Carter, but most folks in my town just called me Granny Ellie. I've lived in Willow Creek, a sleepy little town in the heartland of America, for more than 60 years. It's a place where everybody knows everybody, where the church bell rings at noon like clockwork, and the scent of homemade pies floats through the air every Sunday after service. We're a small community, but it's the kind of town that makes you feel like family even if you've lived next door for just a few months. But let me tell you, what I'm about to share is not a simple story of love, loss, or growing old. No, this is a story about betrayal, about greed that blinds people to blood ties, and about a silent battle that taught me what true strength really means. I had 2 children, Michael and Susan, and a husband, Charles, who passed away many years ago. We weren't rich, but we had enough to get by. Charles and I built this old farmhouse brick by brick. It wasn't just a house, it was home. We had the fields, the garden, and even a small barn where I raised chickens and on a whim, once kept 2 goats. It was simple living, but it was ours. After Charles passed, I poured everything I had into raising my children. I worked 2 jobs for years. I cleaned houses in the mornings and baked pies for the local diner in the evenings. I sacrificed trips, comforts, even my health, but I never complained. I wanted Michael and Susan to have opportunities one never did. I wanted them to chase dreams bigger than this little town could hold. Michael grew up bright-eyed and charming, the kind of boy teachers loved and neighbors admired. He had plans for the city, tech, finance, something far beyond farming. Susan, my little firecracker, dreamed of teaching and helping kids. I believed their futures were waiting just beyond the horizon. I helped them apply for college, kept the house in order while they studied, and even borrowed money to send them on internships. I told myself it was worth it. Every night, after their calls, I'd sit on the porch and whisper a prayer. Let them be happy. Let them never struggle like we did. And for a while, it felt like my prayers were being answered. This farmhouse was more than walls and a roof. It carried generations of memories. I still remember the day Charles and I painted the kitchen ourselves, laughing as paint dripped onto our clothes. I remembered the family Christmases where the house overflowed with cousins, uncles, and neighbors. Even after Michael and Susan moved away, they'd come home during holidays and talk about starting businesses, finding love, traveling, and doing something big with their lives. But the one thing I never told them was that this house was all I had left. I hadn't saved much in a bank account. Most of what we owned was tied to the land, the house, and the few antiques from my mother's side. It was a modest inheritance, but it represented everything. I guarded it not out of selfishness, but because it was the last connection to Charles and the life we built. For years, I believed this home would be a place where my children returned, not for inheritance, but for love. At first, their visits became less frequent. Calls went from daily to weekly to occasional. They'd say things like, "Granny, we're just swamped with work," or "We'll come around the holidays for sure." I wanted to believe them. I ignored the loneliness creeping in, telling myself they had responsibilities and dreams to pursue. Then came the real change. It started with strange conversations I overheard when they visited. Michael spoke in hushed tones to lawyers, and Susan seemed anxious, avoiding my eyes. One day, while cleaning, I stumbled upon paperwork tucked into the kitchen drawer, legal documents transferring ownership of the farmhouse to their names. My heart froze. I sat down on the cold floor, the papers trembling in my hands. The documents weren't signed, but the plans were clear. They wanted this house, this legacy. They planned to sell it once I was gone, or worse, force me out while I was still alive. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles white. The walls seemed to close in. I thought of Charles's laughter, the summers we spent planting flowers, and the smell of fresh-baked bread filling the house. Was this the legacy my children wanted? I never confronted them, Not then. I swallowed the shock, hid the papers, and pretended everything was fine. But that was the beginning of the storm. That, my dear, is how the battle began. Not with a shouted argument, but with silence. Silence that grew louder with each passing day. In the next part, I'll tell you how I discovered their betrayal in full, and how deep the greed ran beneath the surface of love. Stay with me. You'd think that once you find something like that, something that shakes your whole world, you'd scream, you'd confront them, you'd cry yourself to sleep. But no, that's not what I did. I locked those papers away. I went about my day like nothing had happened. I smiled when Michael called. I baked pies when Susan visited. I sat at the dinner table as if nothing had changed. But inside, something was unraveling. The first time I really saw it was during dinner one chilly autumn evening. We sat by the fireplace, crackling wood, soft yellow light, and Michael and Susan kept whispering. Every few moments, they'd exchange glances, quickly dropping their eyes whenever I looked their way. I pretended to sip my tea, but I could feel the tension like a cold draft sweeping the room.
So,
Granny, Michael began, forcing a smile. You've been keeping the house in such good shape. Must be a lot of work. Ah, it's old bones and stubborn walls, I chuckled, trying to make it sound light-hearted. But it's home. Susan's eyes darted toward Michael.
yeah,
I mean, it's something. There it was. That hesitation. That weight hanging in the air like a question neither of them wanted to ask. Later that night, after they had gone to their rooms, I sat by the window and watched the trees sway. The moonlight danced softly over the grass, and the house that had once been full of laughter now felt cold and hollow. I kept hearing Charles's voice in my head. You'll always be all right, Ellie. We'll hold this place together. But the silence screamed otherwise. I couldn't sleep. The documents haunted me. I knew they hadn't been signed, but it meant they had already consulted lawyers, drafted plans, and mapped out a future where I was no longer needed. The next morning, while they were out buying supplies for Thanksgiving, I quietly pulled the papers from their hiding place. I studied each page carefully. There it was. My name, Eleanor May Carter, crossed out in places and replaced with Michael Carter or Susan Carter. The language was cold, calculating. It read like a business transaction, how to transfer ownership, how to handle probate, what clauses to insert to prevent challenges from heirs. But the most chilling part was in the notes scribbled in pencil. Granny's health is failing. Once she's gone, probate process will be easier. Ensure paperwork is ready. Talk to local realtor about listing before holidays. My stomach churned. I sat back in the chair and clutched the papers against my chest. I whispered, How could you think like this? I felt anger, yes, but also something deeper, hurt that sliced through my ribs. I had given them everything. I had worked myself to the bone to make sure they had comfort, education, a future. And this was how they repaid me? For the first time, I wept, not loudly, not dramatically, but silently, as if the tears were carved from the stone walls themselves. Just when I thought I might lose my grip on sanity, a knock came at the door that afternoon. It was Mr. Collins, the local attorney who had once helped Charles with paperwork. Mrs. Carter, he greeted gently, tipping his hat. I was passing by and thought I'd check in. I hesitated. Something told me this visit was no coincidence. We sat together in the living room, and I brewed him tea. He looked around at the worn furniture, the photographs lining the mantel, and gave a soft, sympathetic smile. I hear the kids are doing well, he offered, pouring cream into his tea. They are, I replied, though the weight in my chest tightened. He lowered his voice slightly, as if unsure how much to say. I hope you don't mind me being blunt, but there's been talk. People are saying the house is up for sale." I froze. "Who said that?" He sighed. "The realtor stopped by last week. I thought it best to let you know, ma'am." His eyes were kind, but there was no mistaking the truth. My children were planning to strip away everything that had anchored my life. For a brief moment, I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he warn them off, that he protect me. But then I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I want to know." Mr. Collins nodded slowly. "Then you need to be careful." And with that, he rose and left, leaving me alone with the papers and the ache inside. That night, I almost confronted them. When dinner was over, I stood in the hallway outside their rooms, holding the papers. I could see the light under Michael's door, hear faint laughter from Susan's. I could go in, slam the documents down, and ask, "Do you want this house more than you want me?" But something held me back. I knew that if I showed them that I knew, they'd come after me harder. They would manipulate, guilt trip, or emotionally blackmail me. They would paint themselves as victims and me as unreasonable, and I would lose the upper hand. So instead, I sat quietly in the dark, tracing the edges of the papers. I decided then, not out of bitterness, but out of determination. I would fight. But I wouldn't fight with words or screams. I would fight with time, with patience, with the strength that had carried me through so many storms. Over the next few weeks, I kept my ears open. I smiled when they visited, cooked their favorite dishes, and played the role of the doting mother. But I also quietly watched their movements. I followed them to the town diner once, watching from the parking lot as Michael spoke with an unfamiliar man in a suit. I drove past the real estate office and saw Susan filling out forms. Then, one rainy afternoon, I found the proof. I had been cleaning the attic, sorting old boxes of letters and photographs, when I stumbled upon a hidden folder behind the trunks. Curious, I opened it, and inside was a collection of documents, forged signatures, notarized letters from years ago, and even a letter from Charles, written, and in that moment, a cold fire lit within me. Not hatred, but a quiet resolve. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. I won't lie to you, dear. There were nights when I cried, clutching Charles's letter like a lifeline. There were mornings when I doubted myself, wondering if I could ever go up against the people I had loved most. But every time despair crept in, I whispered, "You are stronger than this. You built this house. You built them. You can protect what's yours." That's how I began to prepare, not with anger, but with purpose. And that's where this chapter ends. The betrayal had been uncovered. The documents, the conversations, the hidden secrets, they all pointed to one thing. My children were planning to erase me from this house. But I wasn't going to let that happen. In the next part, I'll tell you how the battle within me raged, and how I silently plotted a revenge that would leave them breathless. Stay close, because the worst is yet to come. You know, child, when you realize that the people you raised with love, the people you cradled and tucked in at night, are ready to wipe you away like dust, it's like your heart shatters, but there's no blood, no scream, nothing to see. Just silence. Silence that eats at you from the inside. That's how I felt. Every day I put on a smile, but inside, I was drowning. After finding the documents in the attic and reading Charles's letter, I could barely sleep. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows crawled across it like creeping hands. How could this be happening? Was I blind all these years? Did I ever really know them? Sometimes I'd reach out, as if Charles's ghost might comfort me, but the bed remained cold. I began to write letters to him, letters I never sent, pouring out every pain, every doubt. "Charles," I'd whisper in the dark, "you promised we'd stand together. How could they do this?" Some nights I'd cry until my throat hurt, my pillow soaked in tears. But the next morning, I wiped my face, applied makeup, and greeted them like nothing was wrong. It became exhausting. They didn't suspect a thing. At least, that's what I told myself. Michael would joke about retirement plans. You know, Granny, once you move into a nicer place, you'll finally relax. Susan would ask, maybe a smaller home would be easier for you. I'd laugh, shaking my head. Oh no, I like my old ways. I'm not going anywhere. Inside, I'd flinch at their words, but I kept my composure. The kitchen became my battlefield. I'd cook, clean, and attend family dinners while quietly observing them. And then I learned something worse. They weren't just planning to take the house, they were also trying to erase the past. I overheard Michael speaking on the phone about contacting old neighbors, replacing memorabilia, and handling any resistance. The thought of them rewriting history, as if I never existed, made something break inside me. I knew then, I couldn't sit back and cry. I had to act. One afternoon, I went to the local diner for lunch. The kind waitress there, Betty, always smiled at me. That day, when she saw my downcast eyes, she slid a cup of coffee toward me without asking. Rough day? She whispered. I hesitated but finally confessed, sometimes, the people closest to you hurt you the most. She nodded knowingly. Ain't that the truth? But you know what, Granny? When they think you're weak, that's when you gotta show 'em you're stronger than they ever imagined. Her words stayed with me like a quiet flame. She wasn't offering advice or sympathy, just a reminder that I still had the power to fight. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the documents again. I began outlining a plan, not in rage, but in clarity. If I was going to fight them, I couldn't rely on emotion alone. I needed proof, something undeniable that would expose their greed and betrayal before the whole town. I made copies of the documents and hid them in places even they wouldn't suspect. Inside my prayer book, in the lining of my coat, tucked into old photo albums. I contacted Mr. Collins again, under the guise of needing advice about estate planning. I asked him carefully about legal protections for elderly homeowners and ways to challenge fraudulent documents. His eyes softened when I explained my fears. You have every right to protect what's yours, Mrs. Carter. Don't let them fool you. He quietly gave me the name of a trustworthy attorney in town and promised to help if needed. Next, I visited the church and spoke to neighbors who had known my family for years. I didn't accuse anyone, just asked about past dealings, financial troubles, and anything unusual. Slowly, stories emerged. An old friend mentioned that Michael had borrowed heavily in the past and had hidden debts. A neighbor recalled Susan arguing with realtors before the funeral. Another person said they had heard whispers about trying to push me into a retirement home. I collected these stories like pieces of a puzzle, careful not to raise suspicion. The most painful part was telling my bank that I wanted to restrict access to my accounts. The clerk looked at me with concern but helped me set up legal protections so that neither Michael nor Susan could withdraw funds without authorization. I even took steps to ensure my will reflected my true wishes, not in anger, but with careful thought, naming a community trust to care for the home if something ever happened to me. At that moment, I realized they could no longer manipulate me. A week later, while sorting photographs in the attic, I found something even more devastating. It was a file containing copies of letters, forged documents, and notes about Charles's passing. Apparently they had plotted, yes, plotted, to pressure him during his last months, isolate him from friends, and manipulate him into signing away assets. My breath caught in my throat. I sat on the floor, holding the paper. My hands shook uncontrollably. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal, cruel, and relentless. I whispered, I should have known. But then I wiped my tears, folded the papers carefully, and locked them away. I would not let them win. By now, I knew I had to outsmart them, not through confrontation, but through strategy. I created a notebook labeled Memories of Home. Inside, I recorded the history of our family, stories, dates, neighbors' testimonies, photos, and even copies of letters from Charles. I wanted the world to know who I was. Not some frail old woman clinging to the past, but the matriarch who had built the family, raised her children, and fought to protect her legacy. For days, I wrote by candlelight, tears falling onto the pages. I relived every moment, but instead of wallowing in pain, I channeled it into words. I told myself, this is for you, Charles, and for every memory they tried to erase. And that's where I left it, on the brink of action. I had the proof, the willpower, and the allies. But I wasn't ready yet. There's a saying, child, revenge isn't about shouting. It's about silence, patience, and waiting for the perfect moment. I kept smiling, kept cooking, kept being the doting mother. But inside, I was a storm gathering strength. What happens next? Well, that's where things really take a turn. But I'll tell you all about it soon, how I faced them, how I struck back, and how justice finally came home. You see, darling, that's when the real battle began. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with quiet moves that hit where it hurt the most. They thought I was fragile. They thought I'd crumble. They thought I'd hand over the keys and disappear. But they didn't know, I had already woven the net. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Michael and Susan organized a charity gala at the town hall to honor my late husband's memory. They planned to unveil plans to sell the property and donate proceeds in my name. They didn't know, I had already invited the entire town. Through old church contacts, through neighbors, through volunteers I had quietly contacted, I spread the word. Come support Mrs. Carter, the true matriarch of our town. On the night of the event, the hall was packed. Old friends, neighbors, journalists, and community leaders, all there because they remembered who I was. I wore a simple but elegant gown. My hair, carefully styled. I walked in with grace, not a tremor betraying the storm inside. When the mayor began the ceremony, Michael smiled proudly and spoke first. We are here to honor my father's legacy and help Granny transition to a peaceful, assisted lifestyle. We are grateful for the opportunity to sell the property and create a fund for community development. A ripple of uneasy murmurs swept through the room. I waited until the speeches ended. Then I stood. Before we make decisions about the future, I said, my voice steady, I have something to share. I opened my Memories of Home notebook and held it high. This house, this land. It was built by hands hardened by labor, love, and sacrifice. My husband, Charles Carter, worked 3 jobs to give this town its first school. I raised my children on dreams, not lies. Today, I want you all to know what happened behind closed doors. I called for Mr. Collins, who stepped forward with copies of legal documents. I revealed the forged paperwork, the hidden loans, the letters pressuring Charles, and the bank restrictions I had put in place. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Michael's face turned pale. Susan gripped the back of her chair. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply spoke the truth. The room went silent. The mayor cleared his throat and whispered, "We'll need to investigate this immediately." The first wave had crashed, and it left them shaken. The next morning, I sat by the window with my cup of tea when I heard a knock. It was a local reporter, Emily Parker, who had covered community events before. "I heard about last night," she said softly. "Would you be willing to talk?" I looked at her carefully. She wasn't here to gossip. She wanted to expose the truth. I agreed. Over the next few days, she interviewed neighbors, reviewed documents, and gathered testimonies from those who had seen Charles's decline. The story ran across the town's paper and even got picked up by a regional news station. Matriarch's fight for justice uncovers family deceit. How one woman's quiet resolve shook a town. People started visiting my house, not to sell, but to support me. The media attention forced Michael and Susan into hiding. Their calls went unanswered. Their plans fell apart. I sat back, quietly sipping my tea, but inside, a fire burned brighter. After weeks of public pressure, the district attorney's office finally intervened. The forged documents, bank fraud, and elder abuse charges were filed against Michael and Susan. I hired a lawyer, Mr. Collins's recommended attorney, strong and compassionate. The courtroom was packed the day the case opened. The judge, a stern but fair man, glanced at me. "Mrs. Carter, are you prepared to testify?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Michael and Susan sat at the defense table, eyes darting nervously. The proceedings began. The prosecution laid out the evidence: letters, loans, forged signatures, all presented with calm precision. When it was my turn, I stepped into the witness stand. My hands trembled, but my voice remained clear. "I raised them with love," I said, eyes briefly flicking toward Michael and Susan. "I wanted them to succeed, to build families of their own. I never imagined they would see me as a burden to be discarded. But that's exactly what they did. They saw my memories as liabilities, my love as weakness." The courtroom sat still. Even the stenographer paused. Michael's lawyer tried to paint me as unstable, but when neighbors came forward to testify about financial exploitation and isolation, the defense's case crumbled. I sat in silence as the judge reviewed the documents. After what felt like hours, he finally spoke. "This court finds sufficient evidence of elder abuse, fraudulent actions, and intent to deceive. Michael Carter and Susan Carter are hereby ordered to relinquish any claim to Mrs. Carter's property and are to pay restitution to her estate." There was a long silence. Then the courtroom erupted, not in cheering, but in stunned whispers. Michael covered his face. Susan sobbed quietly. I felt no joy in their defeat, only a quiet satisfaction. I had not sought their downfall out of hate, but to reclaim my dignity. Just when I thought the storm had passed, one more twist came. Late one evening, I received a call from a lawyer I hadn't expected, the executor of Charles's insurance trust. He informed me that Charles had, in fact, foreseen their greed. Before his passing, he had set up an irrevocable trust, transferring significant assets into it, assets that could only be released if a court confirmed elder abuse. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. With the court's ruling in my favor, the trust was unlocked, ensuring that I had the means to maintain the house, support community projects, and secure my future. I sat by the fire that night, holding the letter. "Charles, you planned for this, didn't you?" Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. "And that's how it happened, child. I didn't scream. I didn't break. I fought quietly, patiently, and with purpose." The courtroom showdown, the media attention, and the trust funds, each piece of the puzzle fell into place because I never gave up. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar, it whispers, and when it's heard, it echoes far beyond the courtroom walls. What happened next? I'll tell you in the final part. Now that the battle was over, that's when the silence came rushing in. You see, revenge is not sweet the way stories tell you. It's bitter, sharp, and exhausting. After the courtroom ruled in my favor, after Michael and Susan's names were dragged through whispers and headlines, I sat alone in my living room and finally let the weight settle over me. I had won. But at what cost? 4 days, I hardly spoke. I stared at the crackled walls of my home, at the photographs that lined the shelves, Charles smiling at a picnic, my children playing in the yard, birthday cakes covered in frosting. All the pieces of a life I thought I built with love. The neighbors brought casseroles and cards. "We're proud of you, Mrs. Carter," they said with kindness. But praise felt hollow in the quiet hours when I remembered how far I had fallen into despair. The house, it was still standing. The land, still ours. The trust, finally unlocked. I had everything I needed to live comfortably. And yet, something else stirred inside me. I knew I could never turn back the clock and rebuild the bond with Michael and Susan. Their betrayal ran deeper than greed. It was a wound carved into the heart of a mother. But in the weeks that followed, I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't something I owed them. It was something I owed myself. I started tending the garden again. I opened up the front porch to visitors and hosted tea gatherings for widows, neighbors, and lonely souls who needed companionship. Slowly, I allowed laughter back into my home. It felt strange at first, like wearing a dress that no longer fit, but then I grew into it again. People began calling me Granny Claire, not because I was a victim, but because I had stood tall when others expected me to crumble. You'll want to know if Michael and Susan came back, won't you? They did. Months later, long after the courtroom dust had settled, I received a letter. Their words were stiff, apologetic. They begged for forgiveness, not because they understood the depth of what they had done, but because public disgrace had taken away everything they thought mattered. For a moment, I sat staring at that letter. Should I write back? Should I ignore it? I smiled, folded the letter, and placed it inside a drawer. The past is like a locked room, you don't always need to break it open again. I chose not to respond. Let them sit with their regret. Let them live with what they lost. I used the trust money not only to repair the house but to create something new. I started a foundation in Charles's name, the Carter House Fellowship, to help elders in small towns protect their homes and rights from exploitation. I partnered with lawyers, social workers, and volunteers to educate families about trust laws and elder abuse. The first day of the fellowship's opening ceremony, I stood before a room full of people. Some teary-eyed, some skeptical, some hopeful. I lost my family once, I told them. But I refused to lose myself again. The applause. Oh, child. It was the first time in months that I felt alive. Michael and Susan's names faded with time. Their downfall wasn't dramatic anymore. It was just another story whispered at dinner tables, a cautionary tale about greed and blindness. But as for me, I built a legacy that would outlive any scandal. I often sat on the porch at dusk, rocking gently, watching children play and neighbors wave hello. The peace I once sought through revenge had arrived not through their punishment, but through my decision to live fully, love selectively, and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That's the lesson, sweetheart. Revenge may give you power for a moment, but only resilience gives you peace for a lifetime. When betrayal cuts deep, you can either let it define you or let it refine you. I chose to be refined. And that's how a quiet grandmother in a small town taught herself to roar without shouting. That's the end of the story, dear one.